It was a successful day. One of my, I hate to call him a hero, but one of the most interesting men to me in the Bible is a man by the name of Nicodemus. And if you're not familiar now, let me start by saying this real quickly. So this PowerPoint, Amy actually put this PowerPoint together with me sitting across the table, creating the outline and telling her what I wanted as we drank coffee this morning. So as you see a well put together, artistically creative PowerPoint, that's her. If the message makes no sense, that's me. All right? But the PowerPoint was good. John chapter 3, verse 1, we meet a man named Nicodemus, and he's a Pharisee, and he's a ruler of the Jews, and this man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And Jesus answered him, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. What I find interesting about this is not the part that most people probably would focus on. It's Nicodemus himself. Now, the message of what Jesus says that a man must do to enter the kingdom, that's the thing we always think about. But I want to take a minute and kind of do a bit of a prequel. We spent time yesterday here, and the elders are going to talk about that more, so I'm not going to steal everybody's thunder. But we sat here and we talked about how to share the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection. And that's great. But I want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about or looking at who seeks God. Who seeks him? Because one of the things that I find incredibly interesting throughout the Bible, and this is Old Testament and New Testament alike, is that it is people who seek God who find him. It's not the one who's not interested. It's not the one who has no place in his mind, is not thinking about it, doesn't really bother him too much. It's those that are seeking. Who seeks God? And Nicodemus to me is the most interesting case because I'm not really sure why Nicodemus was seeking God. I don't have a good answer. But I think it's probably a combination of at least a few of the things that we're going to talk about, a few of the ideas or concepts we're going to talk about this morning. And as we go through these, I want you to keep in mind a few kind of basic concepts. First of all, these are ideas, these are concepts about who seeks, what kind of person, what causes them to seek God, what are their lives like when they're seeking him. But it can be a mix. It can change from day to day. It can be a combination of these things. It can change over time in different life circumstances. There are different times when we seek different things. And it can be something that causes initial obedience, our first experience with coming to Christ, or later on in life, changing course after we've drifted away. But as we try to share the gospel with other people, there are two things that we need to keep in mind. First of all, we need to learn where people are by listening to them, by hearing where they are, rather than assuming that all people are just a homogeneous group who all think the same way, who are all in the same place in their life, and all in the same situation. Listen. I'll be a little vulnerable for a minute. Amy and I have gone through some marital trouble and some marital discord and difficulty throughout our nearly 20 years of marriage. I know the rest of y'all have perfect marriages, don't do any of that. But one of the things that I had to learn the hard way was not to assume what she's saying or assume what she's thinking or assume what she's doing, but to listen. I haven't done that yet. I'm supposed to learn it. That's what they told me. But learn by listening. And number two, see ourselves in these characteristics as well. Because all of us fit into one or multiple or all of them at the same time. And I want to look as we continue. Okay, he said down means forward. All right. Who seeks? Let's go to Acts chapter 17. Now, I am a huge fan of context. Okay, so I'm going to read a little more than what's on the board or talk a little bit about the context as we go through these passages. And if you're an old school person and you brought like a real Bible and stuff, that's great. You should get it out and follow along because it'll help you get the context. If you're one of those new people who does a phone or whatever, that's okay. I love you too. But in Acts chapter 17, there is a group of people. And this group of people, the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there, would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. This is Acts chapter 17 and in verse 21. So Paul is going through Athens, and it is a place where there's a place where people can gather together and they can talk about religious topics or politics or philosophy or what have you. And Paul comes there, and it's called the Areopagus. So it's an area where there's this place of thought, and Paul comes in there, and he shares with them the gospel of Jesus Christ in front of a bunch of Greek and Epicurean philosophers. And I want to notice here as we go through this, and for the sake of time, we won't go through there, but look at verse 34. He shares it with these people. And this is the result. Now, some of them thought he was crazy. Some of them thought he was out of his mind. He was just speaking babble when he talked about the resurrection of the dead specifically. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with him. These were people who were seeking God out of curiosity. They wanted to know. They wanted to seek. They are drawn by a desire for knowledge and understanding. It is, if you will, almost a academic pursuit. They want to know, why is this man talking about this? They were specifically there just to listen and just to hear. There are those who, if you watch the internet, and that's a dangerous thing anyway, but there are those who have devoted a lot of time and a lot of energy into apologetics, or there are those who have spent a lot of time and energy devoted to their message of how terrible Christians are. And they do that, and they're successful in drawing attention because a lot of people are curious. A lot of people want to know. And so think about it like this. If I am trying to share the gospel with somebody and I see that they are curious, shouldn't I change my approach a little bit with them? Are they interested in hearing how God can help them with all of their troubles? Maybe. That may come at a different time in their life. But perhaps it would be better for us to approach them with curiosity. What do you know? Well, how did you come to that conclusion? This thing's going faster than I am. I think somebody's telling me to hurry up. Paul approaches the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 and verse 26. Do you know what he was doing? What was the Ethiopian eunuch doing? He was reading the scripture. And he wasn't reading. He was a devout man. He had worshiped in Jerusalem and he was leaving there. He was a devout man, but he was curious. Who is it that this writer Isaiah is writing about? Philip overtakes it and shares with him who the writer was writing about. And from that knowledge, then, he becomes one of the earliest converts to Christianity. And no doubt took his message of Christ back to Ethiopia. You see, sometimes folks are seeking because they're curious. So us being able to know and to study and prepare ourselves and be able to engage in that curiosity and listen to those curious questions. Like I said before, sometimes we think we know what the answer is before somebody asks the question. Don't do that. There's your admonition. And I say don't do that to me probably more than anybody. Maybe you're here this morning and you're curious. There are things that don't add up to you. They don't make sense. You don't know why it is we do this, or where did this doctrine or this idea come from, or why don't we do this thing? I encourage you to engage that curiosity. And if you want to ask somebody, ask John when he comes back. He's got a really good answer, I'm sure. But I'm more than happy to talk to you as well. Second is conviction. Some people are seeking God or seek God out of conviction. These are those who are driven by what God calls a lovely thing in Psalm 57 in verse 17, a contrite heart. These are folks that have made a mess out of their lives. These are people who have done something that is terrible or something that is weighing on their conscience, and they want to deal with that guilt, and they want to deal with the shame of whatever it is that they've done. And the best example I could find of this was this man, the tax collector. Now, let me set the scene for you, if you will. Jesus is telling a story of two men that approached God, and one was a man who was a Pharisee, and essentially the Pharisee comes to him and he says, I've done all this stuff that's great, and I'm so glad I'm not like that guy over there. And then another man, a tax collector. Now, a tax collector in this culture was I hope I don't offend anybody, just like the IRS is today, right? Nobody liked them. We appreciate our federal employees and we appreciate the IRS and they do good things. I don't want to pick on them individually. But these were people who were not esteemed as being honest. Very often they got their riches, they made their money by skimming off the top or by taking money from those who would pay taxes. They would take a portion of it. And this tax collector then approaches God in prayer. He can't lift his head up. He beats his breasts. He couldn't lift his eyes up to heaven, but he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This is an illustration Jesus uses. I don't know if this was a real fellow or not. I don't know. But it illustrates perfectly the soul that is convinced they have made a mess out of their own lives. And they go to God and they say, I need this fixed. I need mercy. I need grace. I need healing. I'm convicted by whatever this is that I have done. In Acts chapter 2, we've all heard this verse. In Acts chapter 2 and the preceding passages leading up to verse 36, Peter basically goes back and says, hey, you guys are all a bunch of murderers. You've killed the Son of God. And when they heard that, they were, depending on your version, either cut or pricked to the heart. Something stuck them. I'll put that in my terms. And they said, men and brethren, what are we going to do? That's the East Texas version, by the way. What are we going to do about that? This is a problem. There's something wrong, and we need to make it right. And of course, Peter preaches the gospel to them. The opening of grace and forgiveness and strength and healing and renewing. Some people come to Christ. Some people seek God, not out of curiosity, but out of conviction. I don't know about you, but there's been plenty of times in my life when I've sought God, not out of happiness and joy and, oh, I'm so glad to be a child of God, but God, I made a mess out of this. I did what I knew I shouldn't do, or I didn't do what I knew I should have done. I've been convicted. Maybe you have as well. So as we go and we're thinking of other people, when we see opportunity, when we see people who are going through some conviction or feeling of guilt over something, perhaps we should be there to offer the message of forgiveness and salvation. We keep reading, keep going. Crisis. The story goes, if you go to Acts chapter 16 with me, the good news is you have to flip around a little bit. The bad news is you got to flip around and read a little bit. The good news is it's pretty much all in Acts, so you should be safe. We're not going to go look at Obadiah this morning. But in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas are in prison. They've been imprisoned, and they are there, and they are singing. And of course, the miracle occurs. The doors open up. The prisoners have the opportunity to flee, but don't. And then there is this poor guy who, through no fault of his own, finds himself in a situation of crisis. He was doing his job. He was being a jailer. He was making sure everything was taken care of. That's all he was there to do. And then Paul and Silas come into his life. Jesus will come into his life later. But Paul and Silas come into his life and change it. He finds himself at a point of crisis. Things were going okay. I'm sure he probably ate whatever the equivalent was to a TV dinner that night and was probably settling in. Everybody was locked up. All the chains were done. The doors were closed. The guards were posted. Everything was good until the middle of the night when these men are out there singing. And he sees a crisis. Now, for a man who'd been charged with keeping them locked up, seeing all the doors unlocked, and these probably some wicked men too in there, but all these prisoners available to escape, he assumed that his life was over, and so he draws his sword and was about to kill himself. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty serious point of crisis. And it come on pretty quick, and this man hadn't done anything to deserve that. And yet he finds himself at a point of crisis. But Paul says, hold on, verse 28, don't harm yourself, for we're all here. And the jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. You ever been so scared of something you were shaking? I've seen that in my kids from time to time when they were real little. They don't do it anymore. Now it's more I'm scared of them. But you ever been so scared that you were shaking? For me, it's usually when there's confrontation. It's usually when I've got to go fight back something or something like that, and I'll catch myself shaking. That's where this fella is. He rushed down, he falls. In verse 30 says, he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? Now, there's an interesting linguistic argument here. What was he being saved from? Well, I think at least in the initial shock was, what am I going to do to be saved from this terrible circumstance that I'm in here? I'm going to get killed. They're going to kill me. When all these people are gone in the morning, they're going to kill me. How do I get out of this situation? Of course, he's told about his being saved from his sins and obeying the gospel. But what drew this man to that point where he cared enough to ask the question was crisis. There's a man named Jairus in Mark chapter 5. Jairus is a ruler of religious ruler of the people, and he has a daughter who is deathly ill. And he's greatly afraid of losing his daughter, and he comes to Jesus and he says, I've heard that you're healing people. Can you come to my house and heal my daughter? And Jesus rewards his faith and heals the girl. You see, sometimes there are times of worry and times of crisis and times of uncertainty. And these happen to people every day. There's all kinds of stuff to worry about. All you got to do is turn on the news and you'll find something. Nuclear war. Okay, probably you shouldn't worry about that too much, right? I'm not trying to scare everybody. Serious illness. My dad died in 2020 from cancer. And when he was first diagnosed, I spent quite a bit of time in waiting rooms at MD Anderson, sitting there and watching people because there was nothing else to do. But these are people who are there almost by definition because there's some crisis in their life. There's worry. There's something they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know how it's going to end or what the test results are going to be, and it doesn't look good, or they've tried all these things and now they are distraught. I've been to funerals of people from work who I didn't think of as terribly religious, and I'll go to a funeral of their family member just to show support. And we go there, and all of a sudden, there's a tremendous focus on religion from someone who's not necessarily overtly religious, because it's a time of loss and a time of crisis. Now, let me make it clear. I'm not saying we take advantage of people who are in times of crisis. That's not right. I'm not saying that we go in there and our only goal is to, we're going to add some number to, or somehow convince them of something necessarily. But what we can do to people in times of crisis is offer Jesus Christ and a message of comfort and redemption and help in time of trouble. Crisis draws people to Christ, like it drew the Philippian jailer. Now, conscientious. I wanted to say conscientiousness so that it would be consistent. Amy said that didn't fit on the PowerPoint. Said it was too long. So y'all can thank her. This lesson will be 5 minutes shorter. Conscientiousness. There's a woman still here in Acts chapter 16, but a little bit earlier. There's a woman named Lydia. And Lydia must have been quite a woman here. The impression that we get is she's a pretty devout person. And so they come there, and Acts chapter 16, beginning in verse 11, Paul and Silas then go. And on the Sabbath day, verse 13, we went outside to the gate to the riverside where we supposed there was a place for prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. And one who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after that, she was baptized. And her household as well. And she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. I don't know what causes some people to just be good people. I don't know. I've never been one. But there are some people who are just conscientious in doing the right thing. And it seems to me that this Lydia was probably one. I'm not saying she was perfect. I'm not saying she had no flaws. I'm not saying she had no skeletons in her closet. I don't know. But by every indication, she was judged by God to be worthy of hearing the message of the gospel. And the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what Paul had to say. This is quite a person. And some people are conscientious. They just want to do what is right. They are drawn to what is right and what is good. These are people who seek God, not because of some academic curiosity, not because of some tremendous conviction of their own sin, not because of some crisis they're in, but because it's good and they want to do good as well. That's Lydia. Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, describes Cornelius as being a devout man who had done great things for the Jewish people in his area of influence. He was the first Gentile convert that we have a record of. I think it's very interesting in that particular context. You see, we see a comparison between Cornelius, who was a Gentile, and by all accounts gave alms to the poor, did all kinds of good things, and was a devout man, and his prayers came up as noticed before God. And then Paul, Saul at the time, supposed to be the most devout Pharisee he could find, and his behavior come up before God too. But it was because of the persecution he was doing. So Cornelius, in comparison, is a good man. And God sees that and says, I'm going to send this guy Peter. You go talk to him. Or I'm going to send him to you, technically. You see, some people seek God out of conscientiousness. They're conscientious. Their conscience, there we go. That's the shortest version. Right? Their conscience, they know that's what the right thing to do is. I would venture to say that that's probably most people who were, quote unquote, raised in the church. That's just what's been instilled in them, that this is the right thing to do. Now, that can be a problem if there's not an understanding of why this is the right thing to do, that can be an issue for those of us who are raised in the church. But it is a desire to do what is good and what is right. There is a slice, if you will, of the theological world that says that men are terrible, awful, and nothing but bad and sick and can't do anything good of their own. Totally depraved is the word used. I'm not here to pick on anybody's theology today, but I see Lydia here, and I see Cornelius here as good people who were seeking to do what was right. I see good in them, even as they are introduced then to Jesus Christ. Now, finally, who seeks? Some people seek out of community. We live in a time in which loneliness is an epidemic. If you go look at, I've seen people talk about this. There is a vast number of people in this world. You probably go to we don't have Kmart anymore. You probably go to the Target now or H-E-B, and you've probably stood in line behind them. People who have not felt an affectionate human touch in years. There are people who are so isolated from their families because of dysfunctional families that they eat Thanksgiving dinner alone. There are older folks who have lost their families just through time and attrition. Their friends have grown old and gone on, and they are still there, and there is tremendous loneliness there. There are children who have looked at, and I'm not picking on screens. I do it too. Don't anybody look at my screen time on my phone. But there are children who have grown up and their relationship is with a screen and not their mother and their father or their siblings. And this is not me just being a grumpy old man. And I'm not saying that all screens are bad or anything like that. But we, in our society today and in our time today, have a lack of community. And I say that as a guy who lives next to people who I've met them in the driveway, and I know their names, and I've shook their hands, but that's about all I know. And so there are those who seek God because they want to be a part of a community. They want to be a part of people who care about them. I want to notice in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, of course, this is the first time that people become Christians. And almost 10 minutes later, after they've obeyed the gospel, what do they start doing? That's exaggeration. I don't know what the timeline was. Okay. But almost immediately they go day by day, attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes. They receive their food with gladness of heart, with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And look here, the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. They grew because there was somebody to grow to. Yes, this was about them understanding their place before God and their eternal condition. Yes, they understood that. Yes, they understood what it meant to repent of their sins. Yes, they knew what it meant to be baptized into Christ. Yes, they understood that. But immediately they were drawn together. Christians from all over the world, the known world at the time, drawn together there. I'm not saying they were lonely like we were or are in our society today, but something was drawing them, and it was the community. And how do I know this? Well, because that's what Jesus said they would do. Curiosity draws some. Conviction, I've made a mess out of my life, draws some. Crisis, the death of a loved one, a serious illness, the loss of a job, a house burns down, a foreclosure, the loss of a child. Crisis, conscientious. Some people seek God just because they want to do what's right. They want to be right before God. community. Some people seek him because they see people who are living their lives consistent with a group of people who is blessed by God and wants to serve him and cares about each other. Jesus said, of all the things, if you want to summarize the whole story, is love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Some people want that community. Some people don't even know necessarily that they need that community. But I want to leave you with one last passage. As you think about all of the people in the world, the people sitting next to you this morning, the people you're going to stand behind the line in at HEB, the people working in the office next door to you tomorrow, the people that are going to be, you're going to interact with, family members or what have you. Look for those that are seeking for whatever reason. And if you are seeking this morning for any of those reasons, or maybe you've got a better reason than those. This is not an exhaustive list. It was just all the ones I could think of that started with C. If you're seeking, then know that what you have here, hopefully, is a group of people that Jesus describes in John chapter 13, verse 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another, and by this all people will know that you are my disciples, by how often you go to church. Oh. By what name is on the building outside. Oh. By how perfect you live your life in every possible way. By what your last name is. By how financially successful you are. By how wonderful you seem to be, how knowledgeable you seem to be. By how many degrees you have, nothing wrong with degrees, by how many degrees you have after your name. No. People are going to know it because you have love for one another.
Amen.
That's how they're going to know. And so my encouragement would be to you, if you are one who is seeking and you don't have answers for whatever reason, let us help you. Let us love you if we can. Let us know what we can do. And if you are one who has sought Jesus and found him, look for those that are seeking for any number of reasons and go out into the world. If we can help you, please let your need be known as we stand in his